Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome back to the show Gordon White. He first became interested in Western occultism at the age of 13, following a series of intense dream experiences. And this interest became a lifelong pursuit. He has done work for BBC magazines, Discovery Channel, and news media companies in both hemispheres. He held senior data and analytics positions in global media companies, as well as starting a chaos magic blog and podcast called Rune Soup, which ultimately led to the publication of his first 3 books, The Chaos Protocols, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, and Pieces of 8. The overriding mission of his work is an attempt to cohere an evidence-based Western magical worldview that combines history, paranormal research, the best available scientific research, and ufology. Gordon, welcome back. How are you tonight?
Well, thank you for having me back.
Thank you so much for coming on. I always look forward to having you because we can go in really any direction my show has ever gone. And tonight, I really want to do just that. I want to kind of go off in all kind of directions here, have a good time. For the past couple of years, the more I've been researching and having guests like yourself on, I realize more and more the profound connections there are with ufology, paranormal phenomenon, magical practices, the occult, and human consciousness. And I also find the more I learn and the deeper I go, it just turns up even more questions. Well, before we get to any of that, tonight I would like to start out talking a bit about our current situation. It's certainly the strangest situation of my lifetime that I think we've experienced as a planet, and definitely one of the strangest in modern history. I'd like to get your take on maybe the bigger picture of what could possibly be going on right now.
Sure. Well, I mean, as a lot of people have kind of observed, we all expected 9/11 to be the biggest op of our lifetimes, but guess not. Guess
Right.
That one was only good for about 18 or 19 years. So, funnily enough, we're at a juncture where you can either tip down the endless rabbit hole of conspiracies hobby, and I like that. That's cool, right? Like all this kind of stuff is a fun hobby. But the good news is it's almost like a fork in the road, because we've been through what is clearly a manipulated narrative, to the point that we have sufficient information to know that whatever is going on, whatever you think the quote-unquote virus is and so on, probably not going to die of that. It's not going to kill 3 million Americans, all the rest of it. So you're at a juncture where you go, okay, cool. So we do know vaguely what the next couple of months to couple of years are going to look like, and it is going to be this battle between digital surveillance and total control, and how you weave in and out of that in a situation of 30% unemployment, which is disastrous. So it's a fork in the road, and I think at the moment people are confusing one for the other. Now, think about it this way, and I used this in my newsletter last week. The whole world has just effectively watched World Trade Center 7 collapse in front of them at freefall, right? So people who've been in conspiracy land for longer kind of have the skills to realize, okay, something's going on that is not on the level. For a lot of people, they're having to do a bunch of things at once, which is realize they live in a world that doesn't operate the way they were told, and also navigate losing jobs and being housing insecure and whatever. So they've got a lot going on. And we need to realize that if you take something like even JFK, people have been arguing the minutiae for half a century about what went on. So if you want to drop down into, oh, it's a bioweapon made by the Chinese, it's a bioweapon made by the Americans and released in China, it's this, it's that, it's this, it's that. You need to realize, and conspiracy people know this already, that argument or area of research is a polite way of describing it, will be continuing on the day you die, in the same way it has for JFK and 9/11 and everything else. Now, it doesn't mean that there's nothing in there. It's more that this week, and in particular today of all days, we've sort of reached an inflection point where we have enough information, enough actionable intelligence on a personal basis to go, right, so I know enough in the broad scheme of things that the story of whatever this virus is has been deliberately overstated to roll out a technocratic agenda. I don't actually need to know at this point, bioweapon, not bioweapon, this, that, whatever. I don't need to know that at this point, because I'm assuming you're not immunocompromised or over the age of 70 or all that kind of stuff, right? For most people listening, they're like, right, cool. So I'm not going to die of this. So my actual challenge is how I navigate the Great Depression 2.0, right? So that's kind of what I think is going on. There's a lot going on, and also that it is naturally human nature to jump in and think, which is impossible, that we have all the answers at this point in time. That's just impossible. Just think back to all your other favorite, and it's a mean way of saying it, I mean like favorite conspiracies, but think back to all the other areas of research that people in this field are interested in or look at, and the dust, if you will, the nanothermite dust hasn't even settled on 9/11. It certainly hasn't settled on this, right? So that, like, it's a good and bad news story, and it's a call or a suggestion to people to kind of like take a deep breath and split out the hobbyist, and I don't mean that in a mean way, split out the hobbyist aspect of like, I'm going to deep dive on the origin of the virus, bearing in mind no one knows that story, versus is there any tactical information you're going to get in there in terms of making sure your family is like safe and prosperous over the next 6 months to a year. So that's kind of where we're at, and that's sort of what I see is going on. I think the plot has become clear. So that sort of global technocratic power base that is using, and it doesn't mean people aren't dying or any of that stuff, fine. That's again not the tactical bit. The tactical bit is that you're dealing with a transnational kind of like technocratic attempt at a power grab, and I don't think it's going to work, but they've made a decision for whatever reason that it's more important to wreck Western civilization and rebuild it on their own platform, quite literally. And that's an interesting thing to sort of navigate. And the trouble is, even if they don't succeed, and I don't think they do, I have like a kind of Gnostic view of this, that the story of, say, the Tower of Babel is like an eternal warning. I think humans try to achieve total control and total dominance, and it just isn't built into the universe. Like, it just never works. But we keep trying. So I think the story of the next decade is essentially going to be the battle of a technocratic elite trying to rebuild Western civilization on their platform, and people who are uncomfortable with that idea navigating through it. So that's what I think is going on, and that's certainly the read I've taken, but that's the read I took before this. So it's funny, like from a magical perspective, if you look at things like astrology and other like predictive cycle models, you have a map of the short to medium and even long term, but realistically medium term is the most important one for how you're going to live your life. And so I moved from London back to Australia a couple of years ago. We bought a farm where I'm a permaculture designer, so we're doing the permaculture thing at the edge, basically the edge of the world. This is southern Tasmania, and it wasn't specifically a, weird way of saying it, engineered virus story rather than the story of an engineered virus that I knew was going to happen. But we had the timing points and awareness that things get choppy at certain areas. So that's kind of what I mean by tactical intelligence. It would be, there's not any uplift from a magical perspective in knowing the precise details of, in the second half of January, the global economy turned down, and we knew that heading in. We didn't know it was going to be caused by this, right? But nevertheless, the outcome and the tactics on a personal basis are the same. So that's kind of what I think is going on versus how I think people who listen to shows like this should, navigate or continue.
Right. And you mentioned that whoever these powers in charge of this nonsense, that you don't think it's going to work. You think, the plan will maybe eventually fall apart. Something very encouraging I've seen that's coinciding with, it seems a mass awakening in general, even before this was happening, people kind of realizing things that have been going on behind the scenes, questioning more. That has intensified, I think, like maybe more than tenfold. It's good to see, people questioning more. They had a video with Ellen DeGeneres interviewing Bill Gates, and she pulled it because of all the negative comments that were coming through on it.
And that Marina Abramovich art project that Microsoft started advertising on Good Friday, just in case, like, they spend all this time trying to pretend, or that's the wrong way of saying it. There are millions of people who think that they're participating in a literally satanic elite. And so they wait till Good Friday to drop a Marina Abramovich video on YouTube. I'm like, well, this isn't really helping your case, right? I think, but this is actually how they lose. And it was the same thing for the 2016 election and everywhere else where this quote unquote populism or whatever has upwelled. The technocratic elite have had their entire careers of essentially, turning Arab children to paste with drone strikes and rolling out digital surveillance and Patriot Acts and whatever. And their entire career, whatever they've said, is reality, and that's just what happens. So the kind of Clintons and Soroses or whatever of the world can walk into a room and tell you that this blackboard is in fact pink, and you have to go out and tell people that that's a pink board. And so they're actually not used to when their version of reality doesn't comply. And the thing is, I think they think it is. I think if they just say Russia colluded with Trump, that it actually makes it real. And it doesn't. And this is the same thing with the story of millions of people are going to die, and then it's a severe but nevertheless flu wave, right? I think they don't know what to do when their story breaks, and they don't realize, because they're surrounded by yes people, that literally the majority of people don't believe it. They actually know that this is some bullshit, but for a lot of people, they don't know what to do next as a result. And it kind of comes back to what I was saying before. There's a big chunk of people who are having to do two things at once, which is realize that they live in a kind of managed world and also have to navigate what they're going to do for their family's health and prosperity right now. But this is why I don't think they win. And this is baked into the Tower of Babel. This is baked into Gnosticism. It's this idea that the arrogance that you can create a perfectly managed system and say this is like the equivalent of creation. And in Gnostic stories like the reality of the rulers or hypostasis of the archons, the demiurge who does that says, basically there is no other god but me. And then it's kind of like a Yoda voice from above him going, no, there's another, right? There's the real God. And that's it. That's the permanent sin or the permanent fall is this idea, this kind of Bill Gatesian idea that the world would be perfect if he could monitor where we are at all times and make sure that only the right people get to breed and you only get to go 10 miles from your house at this point in time. And it's this really, it's a mind virus, speaking of viruses, and it never works. But unfortunately, and this is the mysterious bit that I guess we'll find out in time, for whatever reason, all those technocratic plans have been pulled forward in an emergency sense. Because this op doesn't have, as far as I can tell, any of the delicate planning of some of the other ops we've had to endure. This seems like a Hail Mary, right? This seems like if we don't do this now, we don't get to do it. Now that's interesting. I don't know why that might be the case, but there is an urgency and a clumsiness. And it doesn't matter because it's still, they're going to try again and again and again. And they've actually set up a story that allows them to do it because they can just declare the virus has come back and everyone has to go back into house arrest, right? So they have what I call in the newsletter an ion cannon, like from Star Wars. They can just stun human civilization for as long as they want, whenever they want now. But it feels like a rushed up. I don't know. Again, we won't know in time, but people who watch shows like this should have enough actionable intelligence to go, okay, well, now that I have a good enough map of what's going on so that information can inform what I do about my job and what I do for my family and so on.
Yes, very well said. It will definitely be interesting, to say the least, how this plays out within the next few months and years to come. But let's get into tonight's show. I thought we could start with something that I started out researching and still spend a lot of research on, have a lot of guests on about, is the UFO phenomenon. Yep. First of all, have you ever seen a UFO? I
don't know. I've seen some things. I had a couple of them. One of them was, and this is why I'm 95% sure it was a lantern. Down here on the farm, I think my first New Year's, I was sitting outside. It was about January 5th, so lanterns are still around, right? And I thought, oh, cool. It was going, as far as I could tell, it was going against the wind. And I thought, oh, it must be a lantern. because it's moving slow and it was just a light in the air. But the only reason I think maybe it wasn't was because I just finished up, I was just coming down from a high dose of psychedelics that day. So I'd taken, I think it was 9 grams of dried mushrooms. And if you know your UFO lore, those two things conflate a bit. So I'm 95% sure that was a lantern, but I'm only 5% because given the context and everything else that it might have been something different. And I live in Tasmania, which has, I think, definitely Australia's best, but one of the most famous and compelling UFO cases, which is, of course, the Jack Valentich case. And that's the one where you have the audio of him flying his light plane to a place called King Island to pick up some lobsters, although he's probably doing a drug run. We don't know. Nevertheless, we have the audio from Melbourne like radar flight control of him talking about this object flying around him, and then you can hear metal on metal scrape, and then his plane was never found. So I do live somewhere kind of UFO-ish, and if people are aware of it, there was a show set here called the Kettering Incident, and it came out about 4 or 5 years ago. It's a 3-part Australian miniseries, and it's excellent. It's kind of like an alien Twin Peaks thing, but if people want to watch that. And I also, in London, had an incident that made me, although I'd already reconsidered what I thought the Greys were, but I had a strange moment of being unwell and lying in bed halfway to sleep. And I had sleep paralysis as a child, like hag attacks and all that kind of stuff, which are probably screen memories for something. And I had an echo of it where I was unwell and I nightmare hallucinated, even though I knew they weren't physically there, a bunch of Greys in my bedroom as I had like a flu or something. So I've had incidents that overlap in the right way with what I think is the most useful way of thinking with things like UFOs and aliens, which is it has that overlap with mystical and spirit experiences and so on. But like I would have sleep paralysis and strange screen memories as a kid. I don't know if you remember He-Man, but like...
Oh, yeah.
So Buzz-Off was one of his friends, and he was like the big beat one, right? And so I had memories of being essentially roped down and nightmares of needles, and Buzz-Off was in the room, and I would shrink down and kind of get trapped in the weave of my sheets, and there was like a Romulan warbird. So my mind, while I was having sleep paralysis, was kind of like pulling, my child mind was pulling things to try and interpret what was going on. And so I had paralysis, needles, roped down aliens, and like an insectoid thing, and that was a recurring dream. So I don't know what that was, but that's just, like, I have not seen, if you're asking, like a giant triangular shaped craft flying over London or any of that stuff.
Right. Now I want to get to the sleep paralysis definitely in a minute, but you said something that caught my ear. You said you recently changed what you thought of the Greys or something along those lines.
Oh, no, I hadn't recently changed, but that was just sort of further confirmation that, because I'm familiar with spirit presences, right? So there was something in the room that presented, while I was unwell, that presented, whether it's a reorganization of my mind or whatever, as a collection of Greys. So the kind of, and I loved it because it's a real 90s aesthetic, the kind of like, gray alien head smoking a joint kind of thing. Everyone remembers it from that kind of, well, anyone who's old enough remembers that real 90s aesthetic, which is fun, right? But the Greys, whatever they are, they're not an organic civilization that is visiting us from another planet in their whatever propelled craft. And underneath that statement is, are they artificial? Are they whatever, you know, whatever they are, it's that. And obviously, quite famously, and I think people in ufology know this, is Aleister Crowley's favorite depiction of an entity called Lam that looks like the Greys, that he did as a result of the Amalantra working in the early 20th century. So that's kind of what, like, there are motifs that look like what we called in the 90s Greys. And that's what I mean. It was having that illness experience in London was my own personal, like, okay, so all the people who are talking about Greys in that way are probably more correct than the people who are maybe naively thinking that they are like organic humanoids visiting us in some sort of propelled metal craft from another planet.
And going back to the actual UFO craft for a moment, I know that probably most of the sightings are ours, some sort of military or just some misidentified something, drone or whatever. But there are some, you know, anomalous phenomenon. I haven't seen any personally. I've seen videos, but how much can we just chalk up to just atmospheric phenomenon, and how much do you think is an actual genuine craft or something that is not from this dimension?
So that when we talk about atmospheric phenomena, you actually, if you live in a living universe, and I think we do, I'm an animist, and that's kind of part of how I'm piecing together Western scientific approaches with being in a living universe, right? That means there are certain things that have a kind of aliveness outside of what, with the real wrong way of doing it, this kind of like Cartesian dualism that we've had over the last 300 years. There are things that can be alive, like plasma entities, that is just plasma in the sky, that if you live in a living universe, they are some sort of being, right? And you don't have to change anything about the science, which is very little understood, frankly, of plasma, about what these things are, to do it. But I have a ratio, which I think I got from Richard Dolan. 95% of like aerial phenomena that are unidentified are misidentified, and that's planes and balloons and all that kind of stuff. And then inside that 5% that is actually unidentified, the majority of that is, you can call it secret space program, you can call it whatever you want, but it's like black projects, right? It's a majority human. Although, funnily enough, when you dig into where that kind of tech comes from, the idea that there's some sort of tech share, whether via a crash or what have you, starts to get more interesting. So at that point, can you say it's an alien craft anyway? And then there's the other 1%. Now, the other 1% submits to several hypotheses, and the idea that that it's a craft with beings in it that has moved through space from another planet is just one of them. Now, bearing in mind, we have stories of sky beings, sky people, sky country, star beings, what have you, that do operate physically with technology and machines and floating boats and whatever. This is Jacques Vallée's research, right? Going right back through history. Now, when you're in in southern France in the 1400s, it's described as like an actual ship, like a wooden boat with sails that will land and wizards will get out of it, right? This is his Magonia thing. That's where the story comes from. So, no, it was the 1400s. Now, in the 21st century and in the 20th century, when people have encounters like that, they look more like the crafts we'd see in the X-Files or TV or something. They look like alien craft and aliens get out. And in the 19th century, of course, we had airships, right? So the fact that they are a physical presence that has something to do with technology doesn't immediately mean, of course, that they are aliens from another planet. They're real, and why it's such a compelling area of study and why it has a high degree of overlap with Magick is you are encountering something that either isn't human, and after that you can say it comes from another dimension, it's been here all the time, other planet, whatever, or it's actually an externalization of something in the human mind. But it doesn't matter what model you use to interpret it, you live in a permanently bigger world once you realize that's a thing that happens, right? Well, you kind of like, shit, so spirits or entities or whatever, there are things in the universe that aren't just like ephemeral spirits, but there are beings that have a physicality, at least when they enter our kind of dimension, that interact with us and communicate with us and look like us and sometimes don't, and so on. That's a big deal. That's what ufology, when you do it right, means that you kind of end up in a permanently bigger world, and I like that about it.
Now, sticking with in the ufology field, what are your thoughts on actual abductions, people that experience being taken on craft, whether it's physically or in their dreams or some kind of astral state, and also how much of this is some dirty black projects just kidnapping people? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, people being taken by fairies and angels and demons and so on, and this comes back to the paralysis thing, is there in cultures all over the world. And I think a lot of David Paulides stuff, whose work I love, like the sort of missing 411 thing, is describing that. I think it's describing that if we are the only civilization stupid enough to think that we just kind of like own all of this. But if you look at, say, Polynesian cultures like Maori, the word taboo or tapu is the same generally in Polynesian languages, and it's taboo. It's like a land like this part of the forest or that hill is tapu, and it's tapu because there are taniwha or whatever that live there, and if you enter their land, they'll fuck with your shit, right? And so I think there is a longer story of humans having missing time and being abducted and being replaced and all that kind of thing that's in spirit traditions around the world. So everyone goes to the fairies in Brittany and so on, and yay, really cool stuff. But it's everywhere. It's in the jungle. It's in New Zealand. It's wherever you want, right? The point you were making before is that said, during the Cold War, and which is also overlaps with the sort of build out of the sort of secret space program, whatever it is, there is clearly, particularly in the US, but also Britain, for the most part, military experimentation that involves removing people against their will from their beds, or paralyzing them, or drugging them, or making them think a certain thing happened to them that didn't. And it's churlish to suggest that isn't going on. So again, you have two things that are happening, right? You have a worldwide tradition that humans can bodily enter something called like the spirit world, and it's the kind of like the Enochian or apocalypse literature from Judaic sources and then Christian ones, where Enoch gets taken bodily up and doesn't come back. Like God takes Enoch up into heaven, but before that, all this kind of literature has prophets being taken up and shown how creation works. Like it's shown the storehouses where God keeps the snow and whatever. And if you actually look at the colors and the things they see, you're dealing with a description of, this is a problematic term, but you understand what I mean, like shamanic or psychedelic journeys. So when I say it's worldwide, it's there. It's every the idea that humans can enter whatever we call the spirit world, bodily or not. So rarely bodily, but it can happen. Or otherwise non-physically, and just simply not come back is a feature of reality. But by the same token, I basically put it this way: I think it's extremely unlikely that aliens visited us from Alpha Centauri to put things in our butts. I don't think that's a good read, right? I don't think that's how you do science. I don't think that's how you do like interplanetary science. But the MyLab thing has some kind of reality to it, and more importantly, abductions by spirits, demons, and angels has been observed universally and forever.
Yes, very well said. And getting back to sleep paralysis, which you were talking about briefly, that is the one, I guess you could say, strange or paranormal experience that I can ever remember having. It was a period of time where I wasn't sleeping well at night, and I was trying to nap during the day, and I would just almost be asleep, become paralyzed. I'd start hearing loud banging noises. Excuse me. I'd see shadow figures in the corner of my eye. I'd see family members walking around that weren't there. I'd see other people that I'd met in my lifetime walking, like, in my hallway. I could just out of the corner of my eye. Very strange things. And I'd try and wake up, and it'd be so hard to wake up. I'd eventually get there. And eventually that just kind of passed and it stopped happening. I haven't experienced it since. What are your thoughts on what's happening with sleep paralysis?
I think sleep paralysis is effectively the smoking gun of the overlap between, and I again, from an animist perspective, I don't really use terms like this, but for the discussion we can use them. Consciousness and changes in consciousness providing access to, or more like removing filters between a continuously present spirit world, right? So mine was classic hag attacks as a kid. And why that's interesting is that sleep paralysis, particularly in children, is that and it's true, it's been observed in MRIs, like different parts of the brain wake up at different times, right? So that the front of the brain is awake, but the back of the brain isn't, so you can't move, and it's also somewhere in there is like the terror centers, right? So I'm happy with that. Like, well, there's some flimsy, but it's nevertheless there. MRI research has shown that that's kind of what's going on in the brain when these things happen. But I have some like considerable experience with spirits, and I would have repeated classic hag attacks, and it fed on my fear, and it was really interesting. So I'd stir to be half awake and realize that I couldn't move, and I'm like, oh God, this is about to happen again, isn't it? And I could sense that it was standing at the door of inside the bedroom, the childhood bedroom, right? And as soon as I became aware, it became aware that I was aware of it. It would rush right in, and I couldn't move, so it'd be right in front of my face, and I wouldn't open my eyes. And it basically fed on fear, like and I know that because it would wait till maximum terror before encountering me, and that's kind of a very classic shape. So it would wait by the door until it knew that I was aware of it. And then it would do that. And that happened, like, not even just in my bedroom, although I've got another story about that. It happened a couple of times on holiday and elsewhere. But when my parents extended the house, I moved to a different bedroom growing up, and my younger brother moved into my old bedroom. And so he didn't have hag attacks, but he would have paralysis, and kind of, it was a second story window, and like ghost people appearing at the window, which was sometimes where the hag would show up. So there's like a place component to it as well. But that was my classic one. And that's essentially what I think is going on, is that and it's how shamanism and magic in some cases works, consciousness alteration removes different filters. And sometimes that can be spontaneous. Sometimes spirits can do that to you. But I kind of think that in the case of sleep paralysis, it's almost like if your brain is waking up differently, which is something children sort of grow out of, I think it's almost like you wander into the wrong part of the spirit world, the wrong part of the dream landscape when it happens. But it's really fascinating information that you can use to start to think, I think, better thoughts about what do you think happens when you dream, and is the dream world the same thing as the spirit world? Because I think it is. Like, is it the same thing? Because you have all these kind of data that allows for things to overlap, and that works with Bigfoot and Ouija boards and whatever. My favorite, because I find Bigfoot quite boring, the favorite Bigfoot story I ever heard was, and it's a Nick Redfern one, where some girls were doing, at a sleepover, doing like Ouija board stuff, and then one of them went home, and she encountered Bigfoot in her bedroom. That, like, later that night. So after doing a spirit contact, consciousness alteration thing, she encountered Bigfoot in her bedroom. Now, that for me, I kind of put with stuff like hag attacks and sleep paralysis, because what you're talking about is the reality impact of altering your consciousness.
Right. Now, speaking of spirit contact, it was, practiced by the ancients. It was a normal practice to have contact with the spirits for many ancient practices. For modern times, what would be some practical uses for spirit contact besides just contacting loved ones that have passed on to say hello and things like that?
So that's interesting, right? Because I put it to you that we are always in spirit contact, because in that kind of William James sense, the spirits aren't embedded in our world, we're embedded in the spirit world, right? So it's more a question of, you are currently in a dysfunctional relationship with the spirit world if you don't have any kind of contact practice for it. And like, on a baseline, and we used to do it, like we used to have, there'd be a family member who would tend graves, people would have, like, and it's a weird way of saying it, like non-Anglo cultures, I guess, will have things like Boveda or, ancestor altars on their mantle. I've got one of them, that kind of stuff, right? So that there's always an awareness that you don't need to go like full ceremonial magic to do it. Culturally, we always did it up until a few centuries ago. So it's more, I would say, think about it as, I am in dysfunctional relationship with the spirit world now. What does functional look like for me? And that can honestly be daily prayer practice. Like, that can honestly be that kind of, it doesn't need to go full. But in terms of what people can do with it, at the other end of that spectrum, you have the kind of grimoire magic stuff where you spend all night summoning an entity that can do things for you, right? But it's, generally speaking, the overwhelming majority, it's kind of like breathing and dreaming. You are in the spirit world because you are a spirit. Like, when you die, you will return to it. So I would say it's more important for people to find whatever their version of a healthy relationship with it is. And the shamanic model is good, is illustrative, right? Because in a tribe, you have a shaman. So just because the spirit world exists doesn't mean everyone has to be a shaman, right? But you're all kind of like, the whole tribe is operating in a world that is filled with spirits and everything else. And it's just part of the language of of being and doing. And I'll tell you, like, they're there when you call them. So the ayahuasca experience I had at the beginning of the year, I had several, but this was with usually it's in the jungle. This was with a jungle trained shaman, but in Australia. And so it was my first time having an ayahuasca experience in diaspora. And it was very interesting to watch the shaman create space and essentially banish spirits that get attracted to that kind of ritual work. Because I could hear the shaman talking as they were like invoking and whatever. And it's in Spanish, so I don't understand it. But as the medicine started to come up, it was more a realization. It's not that the spirit showed up, but that I had altered my consciousness, and the words that the shaman was speaking were actually working. So I moved my consciousness to the fact that this person was just saying words that the spirit world was responding to. And that's the same for you. People can do that. People can ask for their ancestral guides or their highest powers or whatever you want it to be, to just like to draw near or to guide your steps or what have you. And it's a night and day difference. And you can find language that suits your own kind of spiritual framework. But it's weird. Like, it is honestly is because we're embedded in the spirit world, you can actually just say this stuff and begin from there.
Now, for those that aren't experienced with spirit contact, how would you tell if you're in contact with a malevolent or benevolent spirit, or if there's any danger?
So it's generally why you want to start with saying things like highest powers, or pick certain. Although angels are an interesting entity, or are interesting entities, but all things being equal, your ancestors are the ones that have your back. So you can actually sort of start there and you'll know the difference. Now, as when you kind of move out into like grimoire magic, for people who do, then it's a real challenge, because there are entities you're dealing with entities that are ambivalent to humans, right? So that they will lie, or if you just tell them to do something, just like if I just walked across the street and told someone like, go and get me some emeralds, they'll be like, fuck off. And so they will lie, because in the same way we find it really delightful to, like, holy shit, I'm talking to spirits, like, that's fun. There's an element of that going back the other way. It's like, holy shit, I got this human to do things. And in particular with grimoire spirits, they'll try and get you to do things, right? So most of the grimoire ritual is specifically about making sure you have the right spirit, and then making sure it does what it says. And you use that with various god names and different talismans and so on, and depending on whichever manual you're working with. And it's more on a structural level. You realize that these grimoire magicians were aware that the entities they are dealing with will or can lie if it suits them. And there's a personality basis. So you almost can't make I can make that blanket statement, frankly, but you can't make a blanket statement that they're all malevolent. Some of them absolutely are, but some of them really aren't. And if you actually look at the etymology of the names of some of the entities that are found in spirit lists, right? So Astaroth comes from Asherah. So it's not just a goddess, it's literally the consort of like the god in the Bible. And because of the historic process of the rise of monotheism, it got put in like a list of bad spirits and survived through like the remaining, well, the subsequent or intervening 200 years to like show up as a duke of hell. So she also changed gender and became Astaroth. But so there are entities like that were like mother goddesses, right? So in there, you have like a grab bag, but by the same token, there are spirits that are malevolent, that are in that are on that list, because it's like anything else; it's an ecosystem, right? So I wouldn't ever recommend grimoire. Like grimoire stuff is the real deal, and I wouldn't recommend necessarily starting with it. People do. I mean, I did, because whenever someone tells me not to do something, particularly when you're a teenager, you're like, oh, I see. Trying to keep this stuff from me. So generally when people hear about it, they will mess around with it and have an experience that could have gone better. And it's at that point that they either go, well, close this and leave it behind forever, or okay, there's something to this, but I really wasn't taking it as seriously as I should. But that's like a tiny subset, right? That's a tiny subset of spirit contact on planet Earth. There are any number of genuinely safer and more almost like psychologically more uplifting, because a grimoire operation is something of an ordeal, and it's expensive too, the things you need for it. So if you're keen for it, like, it works and you can go for it. But in terms of how you handle the deception of spirit, start with ones that you kind of have a reasonable understanding of. Like, my ancestors aren't going to lie to me. It's kind of not their job. That's not their function, right? Demons will. So choose your playmates for a start, but also, if they tell you to do something weird, you've probably not got the right one. But usually, like, names of God and that kind of stuff is the Western way of getting spirits to conform. There's also another structure where you bind or pact with like a intermediary entity that you have a trusted relationship with, and that will bring it in. But again, that's quite it's quite developed and intense stuff. Generally speaking, if you use terms like, and it's really interesting that this works, but if you use terms like highest powers or ancestral protectors or ancestral guides, you'll just feel that this is a non-deceptive, non-manipulative community, I guess.
You mentioned angels and demons. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. With demons, I find people are probably quick to label anything a demon. And angels, from all the researchers that I've spoken to, it's fascinating entities. I'd like to get your take. Let's start with angels. Are these celestial beings, or do they have some sort of great divine power? What are angels?
So, like, we'll begin with the split of angels and demons is historically very recent, right? Very, very recent. And daimon from Greek means like a presiding genius spirit. So even the word daimon was originally good. It's just we get into the historic period, and they start carving up the goodies and the baddies, right? As the idea of the fall in Christianity rather than in Judaism developed. So the categorization is very late. Where angels come from is very interesting, right? So historically speaking, or textually speaking, they appear to have entered or introgressed into Judaism during Babylonian captivity. So what angels are is actually a Sumerian survival. So Sumeria or Sumer into Babylon, into Judaism, into Judaic Christianity, right? And the word, and it's a Greek term, but the idea of something like watchers and entities. So what the angels are is a culture-specific term for almost like a class of beings in the spirit world, but also the spirit world. So the story of the watchers is a bunch of things. It's a weird memory of almost like an Ancient Aliens event, but except it's a spirit world one, because what we just spoke about was the introgression happens from the spirit world into the waking world rather than from like Mars to Earth, right? But it's nevertheless there, right? And that's the kind of memory, or the realization that humans are fundamentally different because we had an extra dimensional interaction. We still have it, but there was like at least one of these events that went on. And the story, or how that story is described, comes into Christianity via Judaism, via Babylonian captivity, via Sumer. And once you get to Sumer, of course, you're kind of like Zecharia Sitchin world of there's something really strange about the origins of Sumerian civilization. And so if we get angels from there, what we have is like a language of beings who, and this is the important point from a practical or contemporary magic perspective, it is the watchers that gave mankind all the skills we associate with magic and witchcraft. So metallurgy, herbcraft, astrology, all this kind of stuff. The watchers taught essentially the daughters of men. So like the first witches, if you will. The watchers taught all that stuff. So magic and spirits is kind of like the interface. And that's like, because of that, the use of the word angels is like a whole language. So yes, angels are terms we use when we see atmospheric or stellar phenomena. They are also star spirits, but they're also like, it's a much bigger, wider thing. It's a way Sumer described humans being in interaction with different spirits, and that kind of sort of, it's almost like tumbling down the stairs. That idea tumbled into where we are now, and it doesn't look like it until you start kicking the tires on angel magic, and you realize, they don't look like little fat white kids with wings. They don't have like that sort of feel. They're old and have like a, yeah, they don't have, they're not what you'd expect of TV, right? There's a range of personality and feel in them, and they're kind of a bit eerie. The best, or one of the best TV descriptions of them, did you watch the, it's on Netflix, it's a British show called Requiem, came out last year or the year before?
I have not seen that yet.
Yeah, that's worth it. I think that's one of the better depictions of kind of like real angels. It's sort of got a John Dee angle or story in it, although what they say about him isn't historically accurate. But that's one of the better depictions of what angels can be like in interaction with humans over time. So if people are watching it, Requiem on Netflix.
Very good. Now, on the other hand, let's talk demons. Based on your research, what is a demon?
So how I said that the categorization happened historically late, which is true. So there was, think of it this way. We used to just have a word that was just like spirits. And that was, and in there was like good ones and bad ones, or ones more in particular that liked humans and didn't like humans and so on. And then over the historical, well, over the sort of sweep of history, at least Judeo-Christian history, we start to categorize. And so we generally call the good ones angels. So we're in like the 3rd to 5th century here, 3rd to 11th really. And then we have the demons are the bad ones. And this process happens as we start to build out the idea of Satan as the eternal and all-powerful kind of like enemy of God, which really only happens around the 9th, 10th century, right? So it takes that long to build a story. That said, even though the categorization of these are the good ones and these are the bad ones came quite late, it's not that it isn't useful, right? So it is the wrong thing to kind of go backwards and say, because we just gave labels to spirits. We said these ones are angels, these ones are demons. Therefore, demons are fine. Generally speaking, demons aren't fine. So even though the categorization came late, the word demon is usefully ascribed in the main, because as I just mentioned, there are some exceptions, is usefully ascribed to spirits that are hostile to mankind, is a way of describing it, right? So it's almost like they will self-identify as demons, but you get the same thing in non-Christian cultures around the world. So in kind of like West and North African traditions, you will have hot spirits rather than cool or water spirits, and they're categorized in that same sort of way, where the hot spirits aren't evil exactly, but they are difficult to handle and more likely to react hostilely if you don't approach them in the correct way. So that's kind of like, demon is our term for the kind of components or denizens of the wider spirit world that are either challenging or actively hostile. And I think that's fair. I think that's a reasonable statement, even though we can sort of see the historical development of the term. It doesn't mean that they are fallen angels and all that kind of stuff. It's more that our culture used the term demon to describe things that everyone else has, which is beings that are in the spirit world that are malevolent. So that's what I think they are.
Very good. Now, when we look at experiences like what you would call, I guess, divine inspiration, spiritual download, extraterrestrial download, accessing the Akashic records, or accounts of people throughout history that have channeled prophecies, profound information, scriptures, written entire books in extremely short amounts of time, with very accurate information in them. And there's even plenty of accounts of this occurring within our modern history. Is this some sort of spirit contact, or the spirit world trying to upgrade us in a way?
Again, I think it's a thing that's always going on. So the short answer is yes, but what you're asking is like, what is your theory of mind, right? And when I said I think the dreamland, I think, is identical to the spirit world, but I also think imagination is. Now, that doesn't mean we can't create things in the spirit world, but I think bear in mind, there is no materialist model for interior experience. None, right? So the idea that we've just guessed that your imagination is stuck inside the skull and there's no evidence for it. And not just that, no other culture anywhere or anywhen came up with so stupid an idea. The implications of that are, when it comes to inspiration, that when you sit with a much wider understanding or much more useful theory of mind, you can get inspiration from your guides, from wherever. And in fact, the Kogi people, or the Kogi, the Kogi say to think is to listen, right? So you find similar things in different Aboriginal cultures where the whole process of cognition or problem solving involves ceremony, because what you actually have to do is kind of like take your problem and move it into the imagination, or perform it into the imagination, and then the solution will come back, and that's when you finish ceremony, right? So we it's not just, do you think we're getting upgraded or are we getting ideas? I think it happens all the time, and I think we're really bad at it. So my book Starships is about this from a kind of like space program perspective, which is generally the better you get at doing star-based rituals, the more detailed your information about the cosmos becomes. So I think there's something in that like very Aboriginal idea of essentially putting a problem into the imaginal, which they would view as the spirit world, and having it come back like either fixed or advised upon by dreamtime beings and ancestors and so on. So I think it happens all the time. And weirdly, once you realize that, and once you sit with that Kogi idea that to think is to listen, you get better at it. And Jung has this as well, right? So when he was creating the Red Book, and he would sort of drop down into these active imagination exercises, the beings that he would encounter in his own imagination told him they predate him, right? So like these aren't his ideas. Like he entered a forest of predated ideas by using the imaginal. So we have this in, quote unquote, Western praxis as well, but it's everywhere in the world. So it's not just, I think, this is how human inspiration happens. I think that's the story of the angels and the watchers. I think that's the story of active imagination. And when you sit with it enough to your own satisfaction to realize, God, what even is the imagination, and who is talking to me? It's not that humans can't invent things on their own, but more importantly, you can ask for inspiration and have it come to you if thinking is at least in some form listening. And for people and everyone's in a creative pursuit one way or the other, try that, and try it in different places. So I have my farm, right? So I do the Kogi approach, and I actually say to think is to listen before I do the kind of like daily walk, so that so my land spirits can tell me what is needed. And you can so try it in different places. So like go to a church when we're allowed out of house arrest, and just be aware that to think is to listen, and then kind of look at a statue of a particular saint or Mary or whatever, and just note what comes up. It's not necessarily the Virgin Mary, but it might not be. Do you know?
Right. Now, for the last portion of the show, I'd like to talk a little bit about chaos magic. We've talked about it on a previous show, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about it. I myself have always been fascinated, but I've never really dabbled in it. I can barely clear my mind enough to meditate. It's always racing. But I do find it fascinating, and I've heard from other magical practitioners that it can be dangerous, and you have to, be practice and be very good at what you're doing. So first, tell us, what is chaos magic? Give us like just a basic definition.
So the term was invented in the 80s in London, in North London, by Peter J. Carroll and Ray Sherwin. And they were kind of operating in a very Thatcher's Britain sort of landscape of squats and doing experimental magic and so on. And you'll recall there was a book about this newly emerged field of mathematics called Chaos by James Gleick. So it actually gets its name from that. It's like a really late 80s, early 90s Jurassic Park kind of maths thing. And the reason Pete landed on that was chaos mathematics was the realization that there is, it permanently changed how humans understand predictability and reality, right? So you have the butterfly effect and all those things that we grew up learning about, which is that it's not that everything is we use chaos as a negative term like pure chaos, but that it operates at scales that it doesn't necessarily, that are very difficult to understand without computing, right? And so that's the sort of attitude, and it's a big shift from the kind of like Aeonic model of Western magic, especially at the time, because you essentially have Crowley's school of like Thelema and the Eon of the Conquering Child and whatever. So there's a lot of structural narrative that was in Western magic that the founders of chaos magic didn't think was there. It was much more experimental. And then it kind of moved into its 90s phase of, which I love, the Invisibles and Alec Grant Morrison comics and so on. And as with the rise of the internet, it's sort of got its message mixed up that anything can be chaos magic, or just because you can experiment means you can replace the god Apollo with Superman and you're doing the same thing. That's not it. What it is that you can try that, and if it works better, do it more. But the thing is, it doesn't work better. If you want to invoke Apollo, invoke Apollo. But so it sort of went through that phase, and most people who encounter it from this kind of like frozen in time idea from the 90s. But it's not that. It is that you will have to, in Pieces of Eight, which is my explicitly chaos magic book, it's a worldview optimized for optimization. So that's both good and bad, but when it comes to magic, you will experiment to find things that work better from essentially a results-based perspective. That's why it's good and bad, because you want magic to have, well, practical enchantment to have real-world results, right? But by the same token, we've just been talking about the imaginal and inspiration and all that kind of stuff, more or less impossible to quantify except on a personal basis. So chaos magic's really, really good at giving you the permission to experiment and find the things that from a practical enchantment work best for you. Really, really good at that. Isn't quite as good as almost like personal revelation. So it doesn't necessarily have the tools for you in that. And it's a big part of my work over the last decade. This is why the animism thing is in play. It's been about how, because that's a suboptimal solution, right? So if it needs to be optimized, it's like, well, then we need a theory of mind that allows for inspiration and practical enchantment effects to be effectively the same thing. And that's what we've been talking about. So if you consider the imagination to be identical with the spirit world, then all of a sudden you're playing a very different and coherent game with what you do in waking life and what you do in dream, and that's kind of where it's at. But that's chaos magic. It sounds scarier than it is, because the word chaos is very ooga booga, and it can be. There was, in the 90s, there was interest in like Necronomicon stuff and what have you, but it literally came from a popular mathematics book from the 1980s.
What would be some of the modern practical uses for chaos magic?
Well, chaos magic is an attitude you adopt when applying or experimenting, at least initially, with different I hate this term, but like different subcategories of magic. So it's more an interpretive framework, right? And it rests on a couple of assumptions that you make before you do grimoire magic, or before you use tarot cards or whatever, or which is you basically go into it performing the full belief of like a grimoire magician or what have you, because that appears to make it work better. But it's almost like it's a subsequent interpretive framework, because let's say you do an overnight grimoire ritual, Baal shows up, and you bind him and he agrees to go and do a thing for you. It's all very intense and terrifying. You're covered in sweat. Like, it's 5 a.m. You come back, sit down and go, wow, that was like one of the peak experiences of my life, for better and for worse. What just happened there? And chaos magic allows you to have a multimodal interpretation. Did an entity named Baal really show up? And did it all happen exactly as it was described in a book from the 1600s? Or was it was being in that ritual state for 6 hours sufficient to alter my consciousness so that I hallucinated, or so that another thing happened? And chaos magic allows like a multi-interpretive framework. And the general thing about it is you land on the interpretive framework that allows it to work better the next time. But so it's almost like chaos magic. I mean, it has sigils and whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have its own collection of praxis beyond sigils and using belief as a tool. Those are the sort of, and it doesn't even really need sigils, although that's kind of what I'm known for. So it's more an attitude to it. If you gather a bunch of people who identify as chaos magicians, some of them will be doing stuff with runes, some of them will be doing grimoire magic, some of them will be doing kind of like a neo-shamanism thing. And it doesn't have, there aren't things that are like in and out of chaos magic, if that makes sense.
What would be some of the dangers or things that people should watch out for if they were to practice this?
So I have this in a book called the Chaos Protocols, right? Magic will destroy your life, and it's a feature rather than a bug. And that's the same for anyone who embarks on a spiritual quest. But the reality is, there are people listening, the majority of people listening to this show aren't going to do it. Like, they're like, not for me. But there's a subset who are like, this is absolutely for me. I didn't know this is a thing we could do. And if I tell them, be careful, danger, blah, 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 they will just run towards that. There's literally no point wagging one's finger at people who are beginning magic, because they will run to the thing that is the most extreme. And you know what? Good, in a way, because it will, like I said with the grimoires, it will scare most people off who are like, oh shit, this is real. But it will make the people who should probably have magic as part of their life realize, oh, there's something to this, and go to it. So there are plenty of, life is a terminal condition. I think it's more dangerous to not have a spirit practice, especially moving into the era we're moving in, where you need all the advice you could get. You really want your ancestors and guides around you as we head into a Great Depression, right? So, like, the dangers of not doing magic, as far as I can tell, but I would say that because I do magic, right? The dangers of not doing it seem to outweigh the ones of the not. But if you mean like, I have this in Chaos Protocols. You actually can take an Ouija board into an abandoned mental hospital with a bunch of friends one night, and and it's called Becoming Invincible. I guarantee you, when you run screaming from that building at 4 a.m. or whatever, you now live in a permanently bigger world. It's a really unhealthy way of doing it, but spirits are real. You don't know what they are. You don't know what the hell just happened to you, but it is an experience like being abducted by aliens, whatever that is, that will never be taken from you. Will never be taken from you. And that's why when people kind of like wag their finger, like, what's the dangerous things about magic? I'm like, look, sure. If you want me to say, like, don't dick about with grimoires unless you're going to take them seriously, fine. I'll say that, but by the same token, if you dick around with grimoires, you may well have an extremely terrifying incident that makes you aware to your bones that whatever spirits are, they're real. And so it's funny, like, I don't warn people of dangers. And the other thing is, it's to warn people away from dangers implies that we kind of know what magic is and how to get good at it. And I don't think we do. Right? It's not like learning how to fly a plane. If first day of flight school, I want to be told the things not to do. to crash a fucking plane, right? Because we know how to fly a plane. Magic, because it is that interface between the imagination and the spirit world and the waking world and whatever, is permanently mysterious. And there are in other parts of the world like initiatory traditions, but it's not a thing that submits to a full ontology the way flying does, right? So I leave people away from dangers. They just be like, look, it's in my book. If you do it right, it will destroy your life. It does that because you end up having to live in a bigger world. And it doesn't mean you get doesn't mean demons attack you and burn your house down, but it like messes with you in that dark night of the soul way that allows you to kind of be in like a living universe with much more context, all its good and all its bad with it. So that's kind of what I mean.
Now, for the last few minutes that we have, if any of the audience is interested in finding out more, possibly learning a little bit of magic, you actually offer courses. Yeah. What would be the best place for them to start?
So there's a membership to runesoup.com, and the way we run courses is the members vote on what we do each quarter. And because of the current situation, we don't have one for Q2, which is actually a surprisingly good time to join, because what we're doing instead is tactical stuff. We're doing intention exercises together and all the other things that people may kind of need as emergency magic as they're losing jobs or what have you. So we're actually deploying the magic at the moment, but it means you can join and look at tarot, sigils, saints, grimoires, all the other kind of previous courses, and just kind of see if you like any of them. Otherwise, I would suggest Chaos Protocols is one of my books, and that was written almost like not as a first book on magic, but like a first or second book. And it's a reasonably good place to start to think if this is a thing you might be interested in. Or you could just listen to the show. So RuneSoup is a weekly podcast. So just go back through the historic episodes and see ones that jump out at you about different spirits or things, or tarot or things you're interested in, and have a listen and go, this might be for me or this might not. So that's your paid option, your book option, and your free option for people who want to take the next step.
Very good. Gordon, thank you so much for coming back on. Fascinating information as usual, and I'll definitely have to have you back on again soon.
Looking forward to it.